Imagine you're at a dinner table. Maybe it's a family dinner. Maybe it's a first date. Maybe it's just lunch with colleagues. And someone asks, "So, what was your childhood like?" And you pause. Not because you're thinking of what to say, but because you genuinely don't know how to explain it. Not because it was traumatic, not because it was absent, but because it was just quiet. And somehow that quiet shaped everything about who you are, and nobody ever told you that was a thing. That's what we're talking about today. There's a particular kind of person, maybe you're one of them, who grew up in a home where silence was the default setting. Not the warm, comfortable silence of a Sunday morning, the kind of silence that meant don't ask, don't bring that up, or simply we just don't talk about feelings here. And what's fascinating, genuinely psychologically fascinating, is how deeply that silence rewires a developing brain, not in a broken way, in a very specific, very underestimated way. Here's the thing most people get wrong. They assume that growing up in silence means growing up empty, like nothing got poured in. But psychologists who study early attachment and emotional development, people like Dr. Daniel Stern, who spent decades studying infant communication, have found the opposite. Silence doesn't create a void, it creates a system. Your brain, which is extraordinarily adaptive, especially in childhood, doesn't just sit in silence doing nothing. It builds alternative tools. Think of it this way. Imagine you're growing up in a house where the electricity is unreliable. You don't complain about it. You just get really, really good at navigating in the dark. You memorize where every piece of furniture is. You develop an almost preternatural sensitivity to the sounds of the house, the creak that means someone's awake, the quiet that means it's safe. You become, without realizing it, an expert in a world that other people find impenetrable. That's not damage, that's adaptation. Brilliant, costly, complicated adaptation. So what does this actually look like in a person? Because this is where it gets interesting. People who grew up in emotional or conversational silence often develop something researchers call hypervigilant social perception. They become extraordinarily good at reading rooms, not in a casual, I can tell you're a little tired today way, in a deep, almost unsettling, I clocked your micro expression from across a crowded restaurant way. They notice the shift in someone's tone before the person themselves has consciously registered that something is wrong. They feel the weight of a pause in a conversation. They read subtext the way other people read text. And this is a superpower that has a shadow side. Because when you grow up learning to read the emotional temperature of a room rather than being told what the emotional temperature is, you start to confuse observation with understanding. You think you know what someone feels because you've been watching them so closely. And sometimes you're right, and sometimes you're projecting. And a lot of the time, you can't tell the difference, and that ambiguity lives in your chest like a low-grade hum that never quite goes away. There's also something that happens to language itself. A 2016 study out of the University of Arizona found that children raised in low verbal environments don't just have smaller vocabularies for things, they have smaller vocabularies for internal states, for feelings, for the interior world, which means that as adults, they often experience something clinicians call alexithymia. Not a total inability to feel, but a genuine difficulty naming what they feel in real time. So you're sitting across from someone you love, clearly experiencing something big, and the best you can do is, "I'm fine," or "I don't know." Not because you're closed off, but because the language was never handed to you. You were never given the words for the inside of yourself. And here's where it gets genuinely poignant. Because these same people often become exceptional listeners. They're the friends who remember details you shared 6 months ago. They're the partners who notice when something subtle has shifted. They're the therapists, the writers, the quiet leaders in the room who everyone trusts without quite knowing why. The silence didn't take from them. It made them fluent in a different kind of language, the language of presence, of attention, of noticing.
It just also made asking for things incredibly hard, voicing needs, starting difficult conversations. All of that sits behind a wall that feels less like choice and more like geography. There's a concept in developmental psychology called the still face experiment. You might have seen it. A mother interacts warmly with her baby, then is instructed to go completely still, expressionless, unresponsive. Within seconds, the baby becomes distressed, confused, then withdrawn. It's uncomfortable to watch, and what it shows is how fundamentally wired we are for emotional responsiveness from the very beginning. When that responsiveness is muted over years, not cruelly, sometimes just culturally, sometimes just because the adults around you were carrying their own silence from their own childhoods, the developing self learns to need less, to want less visibly, to become self-sufficient in ways that look like strength, and sometimes are strength, and sometimes are just loneliness that's gotten very good at its job. But here's what I want you to sit with for a moment, because this part matters. The patterns you built in silence, the watchfulness, the self-reliance, the almost eerie perceptiveness, those were intelligent responses to your environment. Your nervous system did what nervous systems do. It solved the problem in front of it. And the fact that those same solutions sometimes create friction in adult relationships, in intimacy, in being truly known by another person, that's not a character flaw. That's just a tool being used past the context it was built for. And tools can be updated. They can be supplemented. The foundation isn't broken. It's just a foundation that was poured in unusual conditions. If you grew up in silence, there's a good chance you've spent a lot of your adult life wondering why emotional openness feels like a foreign country everyone else seems to have a passport for. And I want you to know that the gap is real, and it's also crossable. Not by demolishing who you are, but by adding, slowly, awkwardly, imperfectly, the vocabulary, the practice, the small moments of being heard that were skipped over the first time. You already know how to be present for other people. The work now, if there is work, is learning to be present for yourself. If this resonated with you, and I mean really resonated, the kind where you had to look away from the screen for a second, drop something in the comments. You don't even have to explain it. Just let it land somewhere outside of you. And if you want to keep exploring what early environments do to the adult mind, there's a lot more where this came from. Subscribe and stay curious. See you in the next one.